Hello everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a deeply emotional story about love, sacrifice, and the fragile line between life and death. A night when exhaustion, fear, and hope collide, and a small family is pushed to the edge, only to discover what truly matters most. If you enjoy meaningful, heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's begin. Hello everyone, dear friends. Tonight, he stands on the thinnest line between life and death. In an old, cold house at the end of a dirt road, he lies curled up on his familiar bed, his breaths growing weaker with each passing minute, until consciousness slowly slips away. Darkness closes in. A burning fever consumes him, and he is completely alone. But just when everything seems lost, fate has not fully turned its back on him. Somewhere in the night, Huyen senses something is wrong. Panic grips her chest as she runs out into the darkness, tears streaming down her face, clutching onto the last fragile hope that he can still be saved. Beside her, little Maya cries uncontrollably, terrified by the sight of him no longer speaking, no longer responding to her innocent eyes, searching for the warmth she knows so well. The hospital doors are still far away. Huyen's fear, love, and desperation are all focused on one motionless man, the person she is most afraid of losing in this world. Will he survive this battle between life and death? And what awaits this small family on the other side of the emergency room doors? If you can feel their pain, their love, and their hope, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a message of encouragement for why. And now, let's begin. The old house sat hidden at the very end of the road, wrapped in a thick, icy fog. A weak, yellow light flickered from the small window, so faint it looked like it could vanish at any moment. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. Each movement felt heavier than the last. His shoulders sagged, his back bent forward under the weight of exhaustion. A full day of relentless work had drained what little strength he had left. After closing the door, he leaned against it, gasping quietly, needing several seconds just to remain standing. The silence inside the house was unbearable. There was no sound of Maya's cheerful voice calling his name, no warm smell of food drifting through the air, no gentle question asking if he was tired, only emptiness, cold, loneliness. He moved forward slowly, as if the air itself were pushing him back. His head spun, and his vision blurred. When his fingers brushed the edge of the bed, his legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto the mattress, breathing hard, his heart pounding violently in his chest. A sharp chill ran through his body, making him tremble uncontrollably, even though his forehead burned with heat. Cold sweat soaked his temples. He tried to take off his heavy coat, but his hands shook so badly they refused to cooperate. After several failed attempts, he gave up and let himself fall onto the bed. The familiar creak echoed softly in the quiet room. Pulling the thin blanket around himself, he curled into a tight ball, knees drawn to his chest. It's so cold. He clenched his teeth, enduring the shivers. His head throbbed as if it might split open. His throat burned with every swallow. When he touched his forehead, the heat startled him. He knew this wasn't just a simple cold. A sudden coughing fit seized his body. He buried his face into the pillow, forcing himself to stay silent, as though quietness could make the pain disappear. In his exhaustion, images of Huyen and Maya surfaced vividly in his mind. Maya, running toward him with open arms, Huyen standing in the doorway, that familiar mix of gentleness and worry in her eyes. His lips trembled. His voice was barely a whisper. I just caught a cold. If I go back, I'll infect Maya and Huyen. He turned his face toward the wall, running from his own thoughts. No, I can't worry them. I'll be fine in a few days. His hand clenched tightly around the corner of the blanket. He chose to endure it alone, preferring pain over seeing Huyen lose sleep by his side, over seeing fear in Maya's eyes. Outside, the wind began to howl. The window rattled softly as tree branches scraped against one another with a dry, eerie sound. The darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing the small house whole. Somewhere in the distance, a faint noise echoed, slow, heavy, like footsteps. He didn't hear it. The fever dragged him deeper into unconsciousness. Sweat soaked his hair. In his hazy dreams, he called out for Huyen, then for Maya. No one answered. A shadow paused briefly outside the window, peering into the room. The door trembled slightly, as if someone were testing whether anyone inside still had the strength to respond. He lay there, weak and defenseless, unaware that by choosing silence, he had allowed danger to creep closer. And the night had only just begun. Meanwhile, in another small house not far away, a dim oil lamp cast flickering shadows across Huyen's face. Dinner sat untouched on the table, long since gone cold. Maya sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the door. Huyen glanced at the clock, then toward the yard again. That familiar figure still hadn't returned. He said he was just going to check the garden, she murmured to herself. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her clothes. A strange chill ran down her spine. Why hasn't he come back yet? She shook her head, trying to push the thought away, but her unease only grew stronger. Forcing a smile, she turned to Maya. Stay here with Mom, okay? But before the words fully left her mouth, she changed her mind. She bent down and hugged her daughter tightly, her voice trembling. Come with me? Let's go find Uncle. Maya looked up, sensing something was wrong. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and squeezed her mother's hand. The road leading to the old house was eerily quiet. Street lights were few, their reflections stretching unevenly across the damp ground. In the stillness, only Huyen's hurried footsteps broke the silence. The wind whispered through the trees, making her pull Maya closer. With every step, fear tightened its grip on her heart. Please, please be okay, she whispered. When the old house finally came into view, her breath caught. It was completely dark. No lights, no movement. She stopped at the door, dread filling her chest. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly. Are you there? No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Please, are you inside? Nothing. The silence pressed down on her ears. Slowly, she pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, slicing through the night. Cold air rushed out to meet them, carrying the faint smell of old medicine. Huyen rushed inside. When her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw the bed in the corner and froze. He lay there, curled up, the blanket half fallen to the side. His face was pale. His lips were cracked. Sweat covered his forehead. His breathing was shallow and uneven. No, no, no. She ran to him and dropped to her knees, pressing her trembling hand to his burning skin. Wake up, please. There was no response. Maya clung to her mother, tears filling her eyes. Mom, what's wrong with Uncle? Huyen pulled her close, her own tears finally spilling over. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, her voice breaking. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if answering her fear. And somewhere in that darkness, danger still lingered, refusing to leave them in peace. Without hesitation, Huyen wrapped a thin coat around him and lifted his weight onto her shoulders. His body burned with fever, yet his hands were icy cold. "Hold on," she whispered, over and over, fighting her exhaustion. Maya walked silently beside her, gripping his sleeve tightly, afraid to let go. Ahead, the bright white lights of the hospital finally appeared, cutting through the darkness. Huyen staggered forward, using every ounce of strength she had left, praying she hadn't arrived too late. The hospital lights burned harsh and white against the night. As soon as Huyen crossed through the doors, her strength nearly gave out. Summoning everything she had left, she shouted for help, her voice hoarse and trembling. Doctors and nurses rushed toward them, quickly lifting him from her shoulders and placing him onto a stretcher. "What happened to him?" a doctor asked urgently. Huyen struggled to catch her breath, words tumbling out in broken fragments. "He has a very high fever. He collapsed. He worked too hard. Please, save him." The doctor nodded firmly. "We'll take care of him right away." The emergency room doors closed with a heavy thud. Huyen stood frozen in the corridor, staring at the door, as if her body no longer belonged to her. Her legs buckled, and she leaned against the wall to keep from falling. Only then did the tears come, uncontrollable and silent. Maya clung to her leg, her small hands trembling. "Mom," she whispered, eyes wide. "Uncle Ye is going to wake up, right?" Huyen crouched down and hugged her tightly, pressing her cheek against Maya's hair. Her voice shook, but she forced strength into it. "Yes, he will. He has to come home with us." The corridor felt endless. The smell of disinfectant filled the air. Footsteps echoed back and forth as medical staff hurried past, but time seemed to crawl. Every tick of the clock on the wall made Huyen's heart jump. Behind that closed door, he was fighting fever and exhaustion, while outside, all she could do was wait. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. She couldn't tell anymore. Huyen sat on the cold bench, holding Maya close, afraid that if she loosened her grip, everything would fall apart. Maya rested quietly against her chest, pretending to be brave, but her fingers never relaxed from clutching her mother's clothes. "Why do you always choose to carry everything alone?" Huyen whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. She kissed Maya's hair gently. "Are you tired?" Maya shook her head, eyes red but determined. "I want to wait for Uncle Ye." That simple sentence squeezed Huyen's heart painfully. She turned her face away and inhaled deeply, forcing the tears back. Then suddenly, the emergency room door opened. Huyen shot to her feet. Maya slipped from her arms and stood beside her, gripping her hand tightly. The doctor stepped out, removing his mask, his expression calm. "How is he?" Huyen asked immediately, her voice barely holding together. The doctor gave a reassuring smile. "He's stable now. Severe exhaustion combined with a high fever. We've given him medication and fluids. With rest, he'll recover." In that instant, Huyen felt her knees weaken. She covered her mouth, tears spilling freely, this time from overwhelming relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You can go in and see him," the doctor added. Huyen nodded again and again, squeezing Maya's hand. "You hear that? Uncle Ye is okay." Maya's face lit up with a small but radiant smile, the kind that made Huyen's chest ache. Inside the hospital room, everything was quiet. He lay on the bed, pale and still, eyes closed. An IV drip hung beside him, each drop falling steadily, matching the rhythm of his shallow breathing. Huyen approached slowly and sat beside him. She took his hand, so thin now, so cold, and held it tightly. This was the same hand that had always protected them, carried burdens without complaint. "Look at you," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Do you know how scared I was?" Maya stepped closer and gently placed her small hand on top of his. "Uncle Ye, we're here." He didn't wake up yet. His breathing remained steady, fragile, but alive. Huyen bowed her head, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. Outside, dawn slowly broke. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating his face. Huyen tightened her grip on his hand, making a silent promise. "This time, I won't let you face everything alone." The room stayed quiet, broken only by the soft drip of the IV. Huyen and Maya watched him without blinking, afraid to miss even the smallest movement. Then suddenly, he stirred. Huyen leaned forward instantly. His eyelashes fluttered, his brow furrowed as if he were struggling to wake from a deep dream. Slowly, his eyes opened, dull, weak, but alive. "Why?" he whispered hoarsely. "Why am I here?" Huyen gasped, tears flooding her eyes again. "You can still ask that?" Maya let out a small cry and rushed forward, clutching his hand. Uncle Ye woke up. He blinked, focusing slowly. When he recognized the two faces beside him, his expression froze. "Huyen. Maya." Huyen frowned, anger and tenderness mixing together. "You scared us so much." Maya's voice trembled. "I thought you weren't going to wake up." Pain crossed his face. With great effort, he lifted his free hand and gently touched Maya's cheek. "I'm sorry," he whispered weakly. "I didn't mean to." Huyen turned away briefly, inhaling to steady herself. When she looked back, her voice was calm but firm. "Next time, don't carry everything by yourself. You have a family." The word family made him pause. He looked at her, then at Maya. Tears welled up in his tired eyes. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly. "Afraid of being a burden. Afraid of bringing illness home." Huyen leaned forward, resting her forehead against his hand. "But losing you would be the worst thing for us." Silence filled the room. Morning light bathed the three of them, fragile but together. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I promise," he said softly, "I won't do it alone anymore." Huyen nodded, tears still falling, but a faint smile appeared. Maya smiled too, holding his hand as if she never wanted to let go. Yet even in that gentle morning light, a subtle unease lingered, like a quiet current beneath calm water. His eyes had opened, but their story felt far from over. Sometimes, survival isn't the end of the struggle. It's the beginning of a new chapter.
Trong câu chuyện cảm động
In a
này,
quiet night
Huyền đoàn
filled
tụ quý
with
đệ
cold
sau
wind
nhiều
and
tháng
fear,
xa cách,
a
mối
man
dây liên
pushes
kết của
himself
họ
beyond his
được củng
limits,
cố bởi sự
choosing
vắng mặt và
silence
tình yêu
over
bền vững.
asking for help.
Cùng nhau họ tập trung chăm sóc cô
Alone
gái
in an
Maya,
old house,
xây dựng một mái ấm an
exhaustion
toàn
and a
với
high
tình yêu
fever
thương.
slowly pull him toward
Đồng thời hỗ
unconsciousness.
trợ Tử Vi, một cô gái
While
trẻ
he
đang
believes
đối
in
mặt
enduring
với khó
pain
khăn.
alone will protect
Những
the
khoảnh
people
khắc
he
gia đình
loves,
chuẩn bị bữa
his
ăn,
absence awakens a
dựng lên một
deep
cấu
sense
trúc
of
cho Maya
unease in Huyen
và
and
chia
Maya.
sẻ tiếng cười,
Their desperate search leads
phản
to a
ánh tình
race
yêu sâu
against
sắc
time,
và sự quan tâm lẫn
where
nhau trong gia
love,
đình.
guilt,
Tuy nhiên,
and hope
sự bình
collide
yên của
in
họ
the
ám
harsh
đoạn
white
khi những
light
kẻ
of a
xâm nhập xuất
hospital
hiện,
corridor.
tìm kiếm Tử
As he
Vi và
hovers
làm nổi
between
bật
life
sự
and
mong manh
death,
và những nguy
the
hiểm mà
small
họ phải
family
đối
is
mặt.
forced to confront
Những
a
căng thẳng
painful
và bất định,
truth.
Huyền và Đệ lên kế
Carrying
hoạch cho một
everything
tương lai
alone
an toàn
can be
hơn,
more dangerous
quyết
than
định trở về
sharing
miền
the
Bắc
burden.
để gần gũi hơn với gia
But
đình và
even
mang lại
after
sự
he
ổn định cho
opens his
Maya.
eyes,
Qua những thử
a
thách,
quiet
mối đe
tension
dọa và những
remains.
kết
Because
nối chân thành,
survival
câu
is
chuyện ca
not
ngợi
the
sức
end
mạnh
of the
tình yêu,
story,
gia đình và sự kiên
only
cường
the
trong công việc,
beginning of a new
tạo dựng
chapter.
hy vọng và an toàn.